Right. Hello. Well, my name is Michelle Morand, and I'm here with Alexander Rowland, and we are co-founders of a personalized cancer research and advocacy service called Cancer Treatment Options and Management. We help cancer patients and their doctors all around the world access medical science evidence-based options, FDA, Health Canada approved, just not necessarily part of standard care just yet. Our job really is to help make sure that you get the best possible treatment as quickly as possible, as close to home, and ideally without even having to change doctors. And we've been doing that for 11 years in Canada now with great success in all provinces. And then again, also throughout the world. So any questions that you have or any needs you have with your cancer care, think of us as at least a place to start to get some guidance on where to go or who to speak to. A lot of our clients affectionately refer to Alex and I and our team as their cancer care concierge. Anything that's coming up, they know we're going to send them to the absolute best place and make sure that they get the best that's possible. So today we're here to talk with you about lymphoma. And Alex has put together a bunch of slides for you, and he's going to talk you through the latest science on diagnosing lymphoma and most critically, the treatments that are giving people the greatest benefit, and how to find out which treatment is right for you and how to get access to them. So that's our plan for today. And then at the end of our presentation today, we will be doing some live consultation with some of you and making sure that you get to answer or get some answers to your questions. I'm keeping an eye on the admitting here and a few other things. So if I look a little distracted, that's what's going on there. I want to make sure everybody gets in. The lymphoma PDF that I created to go along with this presentation is loaded into the chat, and it will be emailed to you after the presentation. So everything we're going to cover here is in there, and then some, and that will be coming to you. You'll also be receiving an email after the presentation with a link to watch the replay of the webinar. So today you can just allow yourself to breathe and relax as best you can, given what you're dealing with. And just take in the information and know that all the notes you need and the extra bits and pieces will be coming to you through email. And we're not going anywhere after this presentation. We're around for you to email or contact if you have any other questions. Alex, is there anything you want to say about lymphoma or just in welcoming folks to our event today?
Yes, well, hello everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. In putting together this PowerPoint presentation with Michelle, we often, I spend a lot of my time, and our team spends a lot of the time updating their information, because there's just so much new information coming out on a daily basis, new treatment options and so on. But I was just overwhelmed. There's just so much going on right now in lymphoma. And I had to pick through everything and say, okay, what is the best? Because that was really hard to determine. There's so many different treatment options. There's so many new drugs and new protocols and new data to show that other drugs being used in different types of cancers can be very beneficial in certain subtypes of lymphomas. So it was just overwhelming. And I had to—
In a good way?
in an excellent way. And I had to really cut things down and say, okay, we'll leave that, maybe do another lymphoma conference and just focus on what I feel is the biggest need right now. And, what most of the patients call us for, and what are the hardest aspects of lymphoma to treat.
Okay, so good. So it's inspiring to hear right off the top how many new options there are, that if you, as somebody who does this all day, every day, is feeling overwhelmed with all the new options. Yeah,
I left out probably about 15 or 20 new drugs. And wow. So it's incredible. Yeah.
Okay. So there's lots of possibility is the thing that we want you to hear right off the top today.
Yeah.
And what we're going to present, you're saying, Alex, is like the short list of the treatments that are providing the greatest benefit for the most common questions we get?
Well, I made sure I stuck with FDA approved drugs. There's so many drugs in development and clinical trials right now that have what we call it's sort of a fast track access to the FDA. In other words, the FDA has approved them for use in clinical trials, and very soon they will probably be available to the general public. But right now, I just stuck with drugs that were available to the general public, part of the new standard care, as we call it. Even then, I had to leave a bunch out.
Okay, which again is good news because it means there's
wonderful
lots.
News.
There's lots. Okay, good.
So,
and we're
individually, if you don't find the answers in this webinar for what you're looking for, by all means, give us a call. We have many other options available.
excellent. Well, that's great news, as I know some other types of cancer there isn't as much new stuff coming out, and while there's new stuff and it is exciting, it's a little more limited. All right, so hoping everybody can hear us. Those of you who just came in, the PDF that will, with all the extra details is in the chat, and this presentation, its entirety, as well as that detailed PDF, will be coming to you through email afterwards. Please go ahead and post your questions in the chat as we go, and we will make sure they get answered before we wrap up today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so that I can be the PowerPoint presenter here, and Alex is going to talk us through some of these slides. So let me just go to that option. Where did he go? Oh, hang on a second. It's not even showing up for me as an option for me to choose. So let's just make that a thing that happens. Okay. Okay, here we go. Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay, give me 1 second here to turn it into an actual presentation. Let's view that slideshow, shall we? Play from the start. Woo! Okay, there. Everybody should be seeing that, all about lymphomas. Yep. How it's looking? Yeah, okay. All right, so that's what we're here to talk about, is all about lymphomas, what it is, how it forms, how it's treated traditionally. That's just the first few minutes here. And then the rest of this talk is all about innovations in lymphoma treatment and helping you to really understand how these new treatments work, and therefore why they work so much better. It's an important piece of information for you to have in order to be able to advocate for yourself as well as possible. So Alex, why don't you talk us through this piece a little bit? Tell us a little bit from the science side of things. What is lymphoma?
Yes, well, on the most basic level, lymphoma is a disease of a type of blood or a type of cell called lymphocytes. Okay. And typically white blood cells. And with the main focus here, you can have what we call natural killer cells, you can have T cells, and you can have B cells. So most of lymphomas occur in B cells and some sort of progenitor of a B cell. And so in short, what we'll be covering today is B cell lymphomas. And there's quite a few different types. So basically, we have this system, which is similar to our blood vessel system. It's called the lymphatic system. And lymphatic fluid flows through it. And we have these little bulbs every few centimeters called lymph nodes. And in the lymph nodes is where our immune cells that target cancers and target disease and foreign invaders live. And they travel through the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system goes in every organ in our body, travels everywhere. It's like a blood vessel system. And, in the lymphatic system, it covers, many different organs, spleen, thymus, lymph nodes, lymph channels, tonsils, adenoids. And there are a variety of different lymphomas. So there's what we call Hodgkin's lymphoma. And there's also what we call non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so Hodgkin's lymphoma has a fairly standard treatment. It's currently a very treatable disease We're not going to focus on Hodgkin's lymphoma because we'd have a short presentation. So we're going to focus on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma today.
Okay.
So lymphoma risk, there's many risks. One of them is, being over 55 years of age, being male. I'm not sure if that's a physical issue or if it's just that males tend to be a little more risk-taking than females in general. Having an impaired immune system. Certain viruses, and there's many different viruses that can cause cancers or are associated with cancers. A couple of them to consider would be the Epstein-Barr virus, also known as kissing disease, and then Heliobacteria, which is causing stomach infections or stomach problems. But there's in general quite a few different conditions. Anything that is going to put pressure on the immune system. Another thing that's been associated recently with lymphoma risk is playing golf. And that's because especially in Canada and United States, golf courses have a unique status where they're allowed to maintain the greens using chemicals that are not allowed anywhere else. And more importantly, they typically apply these chemicals while people are playing golf. So they will, spray a little section and then, maybe put a sign saying recently sprayed. And then, people are not going to be sure which section was sprayed and play over the area. So definitely there is a increased risk associated with playing golf on golf courses. So something to consider. So in short, we have two different types of B-cell lymphomas, and they typically are originated from different parts of what we call something called the germinal center. So basically what happens is you have these B cells, they become what we call naive B cells, and then they become activated B cells, and then they go into this area called the germinal center. And it's kind of like a packet where these cells mature into the type of cell they're going to be. It's called differentiation. So typically we have this class of lymphomas called low grade, and basically they're also known as indolent, but they're not necessarily indolent. So low grade typically means that they look much like the cell they're supposed to look like, almost like a normal cell, but with a few changes. And lower grade tend to spread slower. They tend to grow fairly slow. And high grade is the opposite of that. It means they're poorly differentiated or undifferentiated. In other words, they look more like a stem cell, or they look more like a cell that's foreign to the body, and they're much more likely to spread. So there's a few different cancers that can transform, and transformation is when you get a low grade that transforms into a high grade. And so there's a few different types of lymphoma that do that. One of them, probably the most common one, is follicular lymphoma. But it's a condition where a somewhat easier treated type of lymphoma can transform into a highly aggressive type called diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And for many years, that condition has been basically non-treatable. There hasn't been a lot of great treatments for that. And typically patients that fail treatments don't have a lot of options when they have a transformed diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. Even a few years ago, there were not a lot of options. Now there are a ton of new options, and it's, precision oncology has radically changed the outlook for diffuse large cell B-cell lymphomas. So the types that can transform are a chronic lymphocytic leukemia or small lymphocytic leukemia, marginal zone lymphomas, including gastric MALT lymphoma, non-gastric MALT lymphoma, nodal marginal zone lymphomas, splenic marginal zone lymphomas. So all of these can transform, but the most common one that transforms is follicular lymphoma. So the two distinct types, well, there's actually three distinct types of diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. But the medical system tends to break them down into two different types. So there's what we call a germinal center. And so they're thought to be derived from normal germinal center B cells. They are what we call a post-germinal, a germinal center-based disease. In other words, they come from this area of differentiation where the cells are still considered, where they consider the germinal center. And then you have activated B cells, and they're thought to arise from germinal center B cells that are arrested during what we call plasmacytic differentiation. You don't need to know these terms, but this is a post-germinal center transformation process. The reason we're going into this, and you definitely don't need to understand the difference, is you just need to understand that these two types of diffuse large B-cell lymphomas come from two different places. And the reason one is, the reason we need to separate one is they have very different prognosis. They have different genes causing or driving the development of the cancers. So we have basically B-cell, GCB, germinal center B cells, and ABC, which are activated B cells. So in general, ABC subtype, activated B cell subtype, is associated with a substantially worse outcome when treated with standard chemo or immunotherapy or standard care in general. Now, in addition to that, there's also another type. It's called the double hit lymphoma or double expressor lymphoma. And in general, the medical system just says you either have a GCB type or a non-GCB type. So both 2 and 3 are what we call non-GCB types.
Okay.
Next slide.
Okay. Look at you.
Yeah. Yeah. So there we go.
Okay.
So in general, they're divided into germinal or non-germinal. And most of the studies will say germinal or non-germinal. And if it's non-germinal, just assume it's either a double hit or a ABC subtype.
Okay.
So yeah, germinal center B-cell lymphomas have much better prognosis, and they can respond to standard chemoimmunotherapy, although the response is not that good.
Okay. All right. And so when you're just to be clear, when you're talking about these responses, you're talking about standard chemo and radiation.
Definitely, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily true with precision oncology.
Well, the beauty of precision oncology is it addresses the individual molecular and genetic changes that cause these subtypes. So when you use precision oncology, you are actually treating the type of cancer you have and not generalizing.
Okay.
So a bit on standard diagnosing of lymphoma. And if you have lymphoma, I'm sure you're aware of all of this. Often it starts with a scan. There's a pain somewhere or a lump somewhere in the body. A CT scan is pretty common. Bone scans are common. MRI, then a biopsy, and then they do a pathology analysis on it.
Okay.
So standard imaging. This is used to show where a mass is. If there's a difference in tissue density. The problem is with these sort of scans is they can show a mass, but they can't tell you for sure whether it's cancer or not. And so there's another technology that is actually very, very beneficial in lymphomas that is not commonly used a lot in Canada, and it's called PET-CT. Mm. So Michelle, would you like to tell us about PET-CT?
Well, I know I've got a slide on it somewhere. Oh, look at that. Imagine that. Well, I can tell you from my experience as a client support and an advocacy person, not from a scientist. My background is in counseling and advocacy and helping people access these options. Yours is the science side, but having had a PET-CT not so long ago to find a tumor that nobody could find that was actually very sizable and thankfully removed. successfully. What happens in a PET CT that is different from a CT or MRI, which Alex just mentioned, really kind of looks at, is there something there that shouldn't be, and requires numerous scans over time in order to see if that thing is growing or not, and is it problematic or not. You guys probably, this is preaching to the choir, you've probably been through a CT and or MRI, if not a few of them. The difference with the PET CT is that it's combining two technologies. The patient is injected with a radioactive isotope that's mixed in a glucose solution, like a sugary solution. And cancer cells are very, very hungry all the time, and they really love sugars. You probably know that already as well. So the radioactive isotope, when it gets mixed in that sugary solution, is preferentially eaten by these cancer cells. And so about a half hour after that injection, when you go into the CT type machine, any place that has absorbed some of that radioactive syrup glows. And the more aggressive the tumor, the more it glows, because the more it has eaten or drunk of the serum. So with one scan, that takes, total from the time you arrive to the time you leave, maybe a couple of hours, you can definitively discern whether you have cancer or not, where it is, if it's metastasized, which tumors are most aggressive. PET CT is used as standard diagnostics in numerous countries around the world. But as you can see from my little statistic in red at the bottom there, from a 2016 study by the World Health Organization, Canada ranked 23 out of 28 countries with public medical systems for their diagnostics for cancer. Because, well, for a number of reasons, they're not, but fundamentally one of them is that they're using kind of cheaper but somewhat outdated imaging technology. Of course, with cancer, time matters. You knowing right away what's going on where, it is quite critical to getting the best treatment right away. The other thing that I've got highlighted in red there, which I wanted you to know in case you're wondering, how big of a deal is it? And we often hear people say, since watching your presentation or talking to you, Michelle, I went and I asked my doctor for a PET CT and they said I don't need one, that I've already, they've already got enough information, or they said it won't change anything, so not to waste my time with that. Well, the statistics for Canada, not just the rest of the world, show that when you get a PET CT, oncologists will change their treatment plan for you 80% of the time. Over 80% of the time, actually, the statistic is higher. So the fact is that one scan alone makes a big difference to the accuracy of your diagnosis and to the quality of your treatment. So PET CT over CT, every chance you get. In Canada, we have a handful, I think there might be 8 private scanning machines across the country. Not in every province, but in numerous provinces. In the US, for example, well, in Canada, in public healthcare system, we have about 25 PET CT machines. In the US, they have 3,500, to give you contrast. In the UK and Australia and Germany, for example, many, many hundreds of PET CT machines. It's part of their kind of standard diagnostic process. So there's more that can be done if you're Canadian, for sure, starting with this one piece alone, if you haven't had one already.
Yeah, if I may, if you maybe go back to the PET CT slide,
sure.
yeah. I'm going to just update a few things there.
Oh, sure.
So basically what, I think you did a great job there, Michelle. I think there's some important things to consider here. Okay. The difference between a PET CT and a normal scan is that the PET CT tells you whether something is active, metabolically active or not. So cancer cells are highly metabolic. They're constantly growing, they're constantly eating, and they're constantly requiring a lot of blood flow. So as a consequence, when you inject this radioactive sugar, and I don't think it's glucose, it's a different type of sugar, but it's very similar to glucose. When they inject you with this radioactive sugar solution, any tissue that's growing really fast is going to take up more of this solution than the surrounding tissue. So CT scan, MRI, any other imaging form will tell you that there's a tissue with a lump that has a different density, but it doesn't tell you whether that tissue is cancerous or not. It could be benign, could be marbles you swallowed as a kid, could be anything. The PET CT gives you biological activity, and more importantly, the amount of this radioactive sugar solution that a lump drinks up is referred to as the SUV max, serum uptake value. And what that does is it tells you how aggressive that lump is. So you may have a bunch of different lumps throughout your body, and your doctors are focusing on this big, 5 centimeter lump somewhere and saying, oh, this is a tumor, the other ones, are not that important. But that large lump may only have an SUV of 2 or 3. Whereas you may have a very small lump somewhere else that has an SUV of 30. And that one is going to be more aggressive and more likely to grow. And that's the one that should be targeted for treatment versus the one that's 8 centimeters. You may also have a really big lump that has no SUV activity, or because it's dead. And sometimes tumor cells or tumors grow so fast that they cut off their own food supply and they end up dying and becoming necrotic. It's not uncommon to see that. So also, when your doctor gets a biopsy, I can't tell you how many times we've had patients say, well, there was a lump, the doctor's biopsied, and it came back as not cancer. And then, 6 months later, the person's got metastatic stage 4 cancer because they were dropped. If you don't get a PET CT before you get a biopsy, there's a really good chance that the doctors are not going to get the actual tumor when they do the biopsy. So any cancer, you need to get a PET CT. It's really imperative, or you could actually not get diagnosed properly or even get misdiagnosed. And the statistic Michelle had there is actually probably closer to 90%. So when patients get a private PET CT and then they bring that to their doctor, in probably I think it's about 87, 89% of the time, the doctor finds that their original treatment plan was wrong and they need to adapt it and change it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, significant. Thanks, Alex. That was actually a real helpful addition there and much more sciencey about the metabolic activity and the serum uptake stuff for sure. Now a little bit about biopsy, which if we could do a show of hands, probably all of you have had at this point. Essentially some tissue is taken either through various ways, shapes, and means, either through a formal surgery or some sort of needle or testing of some sort. And the biopsy, the goal is for that tissue to be sent to a pathologist who is trained to use certain techniques to identify if that mass has cancerous cells or not. At which point, usually at this point, you're still dealing with your GP or maybe a specialist, but not a cancer doctor at this point. So that information then goes to your GP or the specialist you were seeing, and at that point, you would be referred to a cancer specialist if all goes well. Something I wanted to add about biopsies, because we're going to talk with you about treatment options, and we're going to talk about certain diagnostics that are kind of critical for you to be able to access those innovations in treatment. So what's important for you to know is that how your biopsy, not just how it's taken, as Alex was saying, the scan really helps them to make sure they're actually getting to the bullseye and getting the right tissue. But how it's handled by the surgeon and the pathology lab, and how your sample is cared for makes a big difference between whether that sample is of a high enough grade or quality to be used for advanced diagnostics like genetic testing, or whether that sample will fail that testing. And since so many of the new treatments like targeted therapies and immunotherapies require genetic testing to match you, if your biopsy sample isn't handled well, and therefore through no fault of your own, it's not sufficient for testing, you have no way of accessing those innovations in treatment, because you can't actually connect the dots to what's going on in your body and which treatment you need. So right now, everybody around the world is having this problem. This is not unique to Canada, because genetic testing for cancer diagnostics and treatment is so new. It's 12-ish years old. We've been doing it, but in terms of standard care picking it up, it's still just in its infancy. It's not done for everybody. It's kind of the Wild West. And so pathologists have not yet been trained in how to treat your samples so that they are not degraded by the time they get to testing. So it's a bit of a problem, and we were really struggling with it, even with all of our access to the newest technology, until a few months ago, when we found, or I should say Alex, that's his wheelhouse, found a way of preparing tumor samples for testing that gets around this issue. I think I just want you guys to know that if that's a problem that you've had, we can probably help with that. And if you're thinking about wanting to open the doors to using targeted therapies or immunotherapies, and therefore getting some sort of genetic or molecular testing, do make sure that your sample is prepared properly beforehand. Otherwise, there's a 40+% chance that you won't receive a successful test result. Diana, go ahead. If your question is pertaining to this whole biopsy thing, let me invite you to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I have a question for Alex here. I used to be a histology technician, and I'm wondering how, of course, I've long retired, but I'm wondering how a lab would need to receive a tissue to send it for genetic testing. Obviously, you can't just put it in formalin like you can a histology specimen.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So, we're still stuck with FFPE for most, tissue blocks and slides and so on. What is really important that we understand now for precision oncology and genetic testing, and specifically, is the preservation of the RNA and the DNA. And FFPE doesn't preserve RNA and DNA that well. So the two technologies that we're now using is we're using there's a new technique that uses a laser beam to extract and separate the tumor cells from the biopsy sample. And so it's a little expensive right now compared to standard microscope-based pathology, but it definitely allows us to access a much higher concentration of tumor cells from a poor sample that may only have 20-25% tumor cell in the tissue. And additionally, when it comes to next generation sequencing, which is the tool that is now used for determining your RNA expression, or what mutations you have. It's really the basis of precision oncology is what we call next generation sequencing. There's two different approaches to it. One is called a hybrid capture technique that was developed by a company called Illumina, and that's really the standard for many, many years. Recently, there's been what's called a PCR-based approach. So the hybrid capture is really good for getting samples that are at a very low percentage, whereas the PCR-based is very good at getting a sample that is degraded. So if the DNA is broken down or degraded, then it's not so much affected by the PCR technique. They can use smaller sections to sequence. So if the DNA or the RNA is more broken up, then you definitely, and it typically is with FFPE samples, then you typically want to go with the PCR-based sequencing. If you go with the hybrid capture, probably 40, sometimes more than that, 40 to 50% of the time, the samples fail. And with a lot of the companies like Foundation One and Caris, they will go ahead and sequence and charge you, even if it's a poor sample. And then, you just get this report back that says, oh, sorry, we didn't find anything. And often that's how, the doctors will say, sorry, we didn't find any targetable mutations. So it's a bit of a problem right now. And, with the laser extraction of the tumor cells and the PCR-based next generation sequencing, we're really getting around that. And we're getting a lot more usable samples.
Yeah, and we've even had, Sue, please go ahead.
I was just wondering if this was actually accessible for the general public in the public healthcare system.
Most definitely, yes. It's private, but I mean, Michelle, how many companies are doing sequencing these days?
Well, there's two kind of questions here. There's the laser separation process, which is not accessible in public healthcare right now.
Oh, right. Yes. Sorry, there are some places in the States that do have public healthcare based laser resection. Yeah, but we use a private company right now.
Right, because it's not available in Canada.
No.
Is the fundamental point here. Yeah, no, it's as Alex meant. So for starters, it's very new. This whole genetic testing thing and targeted therapy thing for cancer is, like, again, just over a decade old.
Yeah.
When we started doing this work in Canada over 11 years ago now, we were considered alternative. Like, the thought of using genetic testing to find targeted therapies, many oncologists thought of it as alternative and unproven, even though there was tons of evidence for it at that time. So it's still very new. Big systems move slow. So the uptake of new technology takes a while. It's costly. There's so many good reasons for that. Alex mentioned that this type of preparation of tumor sample, which creates a far greater likelihood of a successful test, is expensive. And when we're talking about your life, not really, it's about $1,200. But in contrast to what's done now in standard care with the standard PCR process, or preparation of the sample.
Microscope.
Yes, thank you. Which costs maybe $200 per person. So just the preparation of the sample, there is, if we're thinking a mass scale for a big healthcare system, the cost is quite a difference. But these things are available individually through private access. And then the most important thing about everything we're going to talk with you about today is that your oncologist can use this information. Your oncologist then, whether it's the genetic testing data you gather or research that you gather, it will be used through public health care to treat you. But right now in Canada, this quality approach to making sure you get a good result from any genetic testing you do is not standard.
Okay,
it's really new.
Great question.
Welcome. Thanks for asking.
Yes.
So the pathologist is going to figure things out, try to decide just with basic staining, is this cancer, is this not? And then that report will go back to the specialist or GP whom ordered this test. And at that point, you will be notified, something fishy here, probable diagnosis of cancer, and off to the oncologist you go. You might end up, maybe you've got some stories to tell about either getting to see somebody right away or having to wait a good long time. It can go either way depending on the time of the month, what's going on around the world, how aggressive your cancer is deemed to be. But that brings us back to what we were talking about earlier about the PET CT. If you haven't had one of those scans, I would not assume that the stage that you've been given based on a CT and standard pathology is accurate. And usually, again, 80+% of the time, it's not. So we do want to encourage you to use those new technologies. Now, in standard treatment, Alex, we have three main options. There's chemo, radiation, and stem cell transplant. And there's a little bit of detail coming up on each one of those. So talk us through that.
Yeah, so standard treatment for lymphomas has not changed in a long time, and that's because for most indolent or low-grade lymphomas, it's quite effective. The standard is what we call CHOP. It's a drug called cyclophosphamide, which is a very, very old drug. It's a microtubule inhibitor. Another drug called doxorubicin, another older drug, vincristine, and then the steroid prednisone. There's another alteration of that that is relatively newer, and it's where they just use cyclophosphamide, vincristine, and prednisone. So most mature B cells express something called CD20. This is referred to as cluster of differentiation 20. And CDs are molecules on the outside of cells that help define or explain what type of cell that is and what its purpose is. So in this particular case, it's CD20 is the target of a drug called Rituximab, which is a monoclonal antibody that binds onto any CD20 positive cell and then causes it to be broken down and killed. It's often used with CHOP, so that would be referred to as R-CHOP, Rituximab, R, and then CHOP. And then there's also radiation therapy. And then for patients that have a good response, they can often go on to a stem cell transplant. So there's typically they're what we call autologous, which is a self, uses your own cells. And then there's also allogenic, but they're not really used very often.
Okay.
So most of the stem cell transplants are self-autologous.
Okay, so if I heard you right, most people with lymphoma have the easy to treat kind, and so standard care actually works quite well for them.
For a while, yeah, definitely.
For a while, okay. All right, so now we're going to get into what can we do for when that while ends, or for these types of lymphoma that standard doesn't work so well for.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what is precision oncology? I've heard precision oncology referred to as the right drug for the right patient at the right time. And I think that really sums up everything. It is the evolution of cancer care because it's based on the molecular features of the cancer. Now, all cancers are disease of the DNA, of the genes. And so in cancers, you basically have 4 different signaling pathways that have to be mutated for a normal cell to turn into a cancerous cell. You can have a variety of different mutations in these signaling pathways. So in theory, if you only need 4 mutated genes for a normal cell to turn into a cancerous cell, it's actually 3 in mice, because mice have what's called an active telomerase gene already. So humans don't have an activated telomerase gene, so that has to be altered too. That's one of the pathways. So which one of those genes is altered can be a variety of different ones. We have roughly 25,000 different genes, and there are many genes in just one signaling pathway. Our genome is highly redundant, and in general, everyone has unique mutations. There are genetic mutations that are common to certain types of cancers, and then there's ones that are entirely unique to that person. So there's very huge variation in the genes, and I've never seen 2 cancer patients with the exact same genetic mutations. So the most important thing about precision oncology is really defining what's caused your cancer, what genes are mutated, and more importantly, what mutations do you have? Because since 2005, basically the last 20 years, all of the technologies have been, or all of the new treatments and approaches have been based on the molecular features and the mutations of a certain person's cancer. So drugs are now created based on a certain molecular feature or mutation or overexpressed gene. And if you have that, then the drug's going to work for you. And if you don't, then the drug's not going to work for you. So yeah, in general, we see a massive increase in life expectancy, a huge reduction in side effects with precision oncology. Yeah.
Okay. So
would you like to explain the 4 pillars, Michelle?
Sure, yeah, it's a concept that came about a decade ago when scientists and then pharmaceutical companies began to understand the power of identifying each person's genetics, or first of all, backing up the bus a while before that, found out that, cancer is caused by a genetic mutation. At which point scientists started developing these tests to look for certain mutations in tumor tissue, and pharmaceutical companies started getting on the train of designing treatments called targeted therapies to address each specific mutation. So now we have this concept called precision oncology, which is a very personalized approach to cancer care. And there's four main pieces. One is genetic and molecular testing. One is having someone actually take the time to look at those results and your medical history and actually design a treatment plan just for you. That's the personalized research and the targeted therapy treatment. And then there's a specialized type of treatment monitoring that is very accurate and fast and non-invasive that allows us with 99% accuracy to assess within 3 weeks how well your treatment is working or not. We'll talk about that down the road today. Those are the four pillars of precision oncology. And we're going to talk about each one of those briefly, and with special emphasis on the targeted therapy and precision oncology treatment element for your interests. Did you want me to go through this stuff?
Yeah, you're doing a great job here. Yes.
Okay, and you will.
Although I do have to say the DNA on the previous few slides has been backwards, so we'll just we'll call that beta DNA for now.
Okay. All right, we'll have to figure out, we'll have to get that sorted. So again, if cancer is a disease of genes or of mutations, then what's most important for you to remember about that is the only way for you to have cancer is because you have mutations. And that brings us back to what we were saying earlier about sometimes tests don't work out for various reasons, or maybe doctors, your oncologist isn't yet kind of up to speed with the power of genetic testing, or maybe doesn't have access to order that for you. And they might tell you, you don't have any markers for cancer, or you don't have any mutations or genes involved in your cancer. And I just want you to be able within yourself, if not outwardly, to call that out and know that that's not true and you have options, because it's not possible for you to have cancer if you don't have mutations. That's what I most want you to know about that. Right now in the world, there are 7,000 different genetic tests, over 7,000. Not all of them are specific to cancer, but many are. And there's more coming on the market all the time. And they look at different things and they look at different numbers of genes. It can be pretty overwhelming. And of course, most testing facilities are out there saying, our test is the one, our test is the best. And if you don't know how to tell what you're looking for and what makes a good genetic test and what data you most need in order to get the treatment you need, it can feel really overwhelming, and you can end up just backing off altogether, or just taking the first one you come across, or the ones with the most aggressive marketing, which aren't necessarily going to give you what you want. So we want to talk with you about the types of tests that are most important and the things that you're really looking to find. And the main three things you're looking for out of any genetic testing to make sure you get the right treatment is, does it look at fusion genes? Does it look at mutations? And does it look at overexpression? So we're just going to tell you a little bit about what each one of those means. I know it's a lot of gobbledygook. So I want to just remind you, this is all in your handouts. It's all written out with even more detail than we're showing here. So you can just kind of take it in and know that those notes are there. So Alex, why don't you briefly tell us about fusion genes?
Right, yeah. So in order for a gene to become oncogenic or cancerous, it has to either be turned on when it's not supposed to be, or turned off when it's not supposed to be. So there are two types of genes in cancer that we look at. They're what we call tumor suppressor genes, and these are genes that prevent cancers from growing and prevent cancerous processes. And then there's also what we call oncogenes, and these are genes that are only supposed to be turned on briefly to fix a certain tissue or have some other function, and then they get turned off. Or they're only active in your embryonic state, and then they're never turned on when you're an adult. So what happens with these genes, with oncogenes, and fusion genes are usually oncogene based. They're genes that are not supposed to be turned on. And what happens is there's a accident or a mistake during the cell growth period when the cell is reproducing itself. And what happens is two portions of the genome get stuck together. And what happens is you will have a oncogene, the coding region of the oncogene that creates the protein that is normally supposed to be turned off, accidentally gets attached to the control region. So every gene has a control region. It's like a light switch, and that control region is either turned off or on based on whether that control region has what we call methyl tags. If it has methyl tags, it's turned off in most cases. And if it doesn't have methyl tags and it's turned on. There's a bunch of other things, but that's just sort of a generalized basic overview. So think of it as a light switch. So the light switch that is turned on from a housekeeping gene or a tumor suppressor gene that's supposed to be on all the time gets attached to a gene that's only supposed to be turned on briefly, a oncogene. So now you have this oncogene turned on, and that's what a fusion gene is.
Okay, and so you want to make sure that if you're using advanced diagnostics beyond the CT, MRI, biopsy concept, or you're going ahead with some sort of genetic or molecular testing, that it looks at fusion genes.
Yeah, it's a good general theme to have.
Okay.
And we'll be seeing a lot more data on fusion genes over the next few years.
Okay, and you kind of already ran through mutation, but just briefly.
Yeah, so mutations affect oncogenes and tumor suppressors in different ways. Typically, a mutation will cause a tumor suppressor gene to be not expressed. It will damage the gene, so it's not there anymore, or it's not functioning properly. And then it will cause an oncogene to become overactivated. Mm-hmm. And typically what that means is you'll have a mutation that causes that gene to stick to its activation partner permanently, called constitutive activation. Mm. So depending on the gene's function, a mutation will either inactivate it or cause it to stay on all the time. And so a cancer-causing mutation is one that causes a tumor suppressor to not work properly and causes an oncogene to typically remain attached to its partner or stay turned on all the time.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to get into targeted therapies momentarily, but just a little foreshadowing. There are many hundreds of treatments designed right now to either repair that problem or stop.
You can't fix a broken tumor suppressor gene, but you can shut down an overactivated oncogene.
Thank you. That's right. So you can stop it. You can just kind of make it a non-issue.
Exactly. But
I know that's super simplified.
Although there is a new drug now that actually does reactivate a tumor suppressor. We won't get into that today, but it's the first of what is an incredible new technology.
Okay, so I was ahead of my time there for a moment.
Yes, you were.
Okay,
yes.
All right. And one more piece that we want you to know about, because this is so important and not done in standard genetic testing. So tell us a bit about overexpression, Alex.
Yeah, overexpression is a very important thing to understand, and it is a huge factor in lymphomas. So and many different cancers, unique cancers. So basically, our body has the same genome in every cell. However, if you notice, our body has many different types of tissues and many different types of cells. I mean, our skin looks very different from our hair or our eyes, our bones, and every person's skin and bones and eyes and features look different. And so the way that happens with using the same DNA in our bodies, what happens is there's differential gene activation in every cell. So the way our body uses the same genetic template to produce a bunch of different tissues is by turning some genes off and some genes on in different tissues. So there is differential gene activation and expression in different tissues. So this is an important thing to understand. So what happens in cancers is certain genes that are not supposed to be turned on get turned on and turned on to a much higher degree. and other genes that are not supposed to be turned off get turned off, such as tumor suppressors. So overexpression in different tissues is typically what we call an epigenetic modification. So epigenetics is what controls what genes are turned on in different tissues. So theoretically, we do have the, we have the genes to grow a tail if we wanted to. They're just turned off in our bodies. So, we have a lot of different genes that we don't use. Well, we probably use all of them at some point in time, but have a lot of extra DNA and extra genes. So basically what overexpression is when a gene is turned on to a much higher degree. So for many years, we didn't have the ability to really do anything with that because, we have 25,000 different genes, and some of those genes have multiple different transcripts. So, that's just a massive number. But now with next generation sequencing, we can actually look at 20,000 different genes. So what we do, and this test has only recently been available for clinical analysis. It's been used in research for a long time, but we haven't really been able to use it for treating patients until recently, and it's been a game changer for us. So what we have is this test that will isolate the RNA, and this is what it looks at. It looks at the RNA, actually counts the amount of RNA and compares it to a normal tissue. So we have this test that looks at 20,000 genes, looks at the expression of these genes, and compares them to what is normally supposed to be expressed in your normal tissues. So if you have, for example, ovarian cancer, then we would compare the expression of the ovarian cancer genes, 20,000 of them, to the expression in normal ovarian tissue. And that tells us this gene is overexpressed, therefore this drug is going to be important for you.
So those are the three key pieces if you're going to go forth and take advantage of the new technology that exists to link you to the new treatments. Definitely, and especially this overexpression piece. That's what we're seeing in terms of finding the best options and making sure they're most targeted to you.
Yes.
Okay, so there's three different types of genetic and molecular testing. We've talked a little bit about the expression and the RNA. So there's tumor DNA testing, which is the most common, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And then there's RNA expression testing and inherited mutations testing. So Alex, tell us a little bit about each of these types of tests here. Oh, why am I using there we go.
Yeah, so as we mentioned previously, tumor DNA testing looks at typically about anywhere from 300 to about 550, 600 different genes that are known to be involved with cancers. And it identifies mutations in those genes. And hopefully then we can match them up with targeted therapies.
And then the RNA.
RNA, once again, that's 20,000 different genes we know. I don't really know of anyone else that's doing it right now except us. And we haven't been doing it for very long, but it's just been a game changer for us. So, many times we'll do genetic testing on a sarcoma or some rare cancer, and there just won't be any targeted mutations, any mutations that we can target with drugs. It won't be a lot of information. But when we do RNA expression testing, we'll get a vast amount of different potential treatment options. The problem is they're going to be off-label. So we'll say, oh, you've got these 3 genes that are highly overexpressed in breast cancer, but you have a prostate cancer. That means a breast cancer drug is going to be best for your prostate cancer. So it can be a bit of a challenge convincing an oncologist to prescribe a breast cancer drug for a prostate cancer patient, or vice versa. But we have found that in this particular circumstance, we get really good results, and we end up finding all kinds of treatment options for patients that normally wouldn't have any in off-label targeting. So next slide.
Inherited mutations.
Well, inherited, yeah. So the most common inherited mutations that people know of are the BRCA1 and 2. They're tumor suppressor genes. There's actually a bunch of different genes associated with that pathway. BRCA1 and 2 are involved in DNA repair and recognizing mutations and preventing cells from growing and copying themselves when they do have damaging mutations. So typically, if we see a person with a inherited mutation, inherited susceptibility, that's often in a person that has a cancer under the age of 50. So when we see people who are in their 30s or 40s developing cancers, we know that they have an inherited susceptibility mutation. So in inherited testing, we typically look at about 150 genes. They're all tumor suppressors for the most part, because what happens in inherited mutations is you have a damaged tumor suppressor. And what that does is it creates a sensitivity to certain carcinogens. So doing inherited testing at a young age, I think everyone should have an inherited testing panel done before they get cancer. I think once you hit 20, 25, get an inherited mutation testing, and you'll know if you have any inherited mutations, and therefore you can avoid the carcinogens that could be a problem. So if you have mutations in BRCA1 or 2, it's not a guarantee that you'll get cancer. What it means is then you need to focus on having a mostly vegetable-based diet, avoid smoking, avoid going out in the sun, avoid carcinogens, don't live in a house that's next to a highway, and you probably will never be affected by these mutations. So it allows us, knowledge is power, and allows us to prepare and avoid potential damaging carcinogens if we know we have those mutations. And so, I think a perfect example is people who are born with type 1 diabetes. Most of us go through life not even thinking twice about our blood sugar. And often at a later age, we start having issues with blood sugar, and our body is not able to get rid of or has more of an issue with high blood sugar, whereas diabetics are used to it. And so it used to be that diabetics, had a shorter lifespan than people without diabetes, type 1 diabetics. But now with, adequate testing and insulin, diabetics live just as long as anyone else, because they know how to watch their blood sugar and they know how to prepare for that. So knowledge is power. And I think everyone should have an inherited mutation test. They're not that expensive. Do you know what the cost of a 150 panel test is, Michelle? Roughly?
It's about $1,100.
Okay, great. Yeah. So
and that's with blood. It's the blood-based test.
Yeah, so they look at blood cells, right?
Yeah, that's for the biggest, most thorough, fabulous one out there. As I said, there's 7,000 different types of genetic tests. Yeah. Something that your oncologist might use, which is probably a much smaller panel, maybe 2 to 5 mutations commonly associated with the type of cancer you've been diagnosed with. That's quite inexpensive. That's a couple of $100 probably.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend those tests.
No, just saying.
A good quality, high quality.
Yeah,
test.
obviously the idea is to be as thorough and as accurate as you possibly can with this stuff. So
I can't tell you how many people we've had come to us and say, oh, I did genetic testing, they didn't find anything. And then when we do genetic testing, we find their mutations.
Yeah.
It happens all the time.
Yeah, and that again, it's because the test was only looking at, say, 20 genes or 5 or 2, really, rather than 550 or 20,000.
Or more important, it was the interpretation of the raw data. And so, this is a big problem. So for a BRCA1, gene, I mean, you have to understand the amount of different mutations you can have in a gene is so large, you can't even calculate it. So if you were to take just 150 base pairs of DNA, which is a small fraction of a gene, I think the BRCA genes are about 230,000 base pairs, something like that. Don't quote me on that. I don't quite remember the exact numbers of it, but 230,000 base pairs is a lot. Some genes have more than that, but if you were to take 150 base pairs and try to calculate all of the possible mutations that could occur in just 150, you would take 4, which is the number of different nucleotides, and put it by the power of 150. And that gives you a number that is significantly greater than all of the atoms in the known universe based on hydrogen. So that's a huge number. I mean, think of all of the atoms in the universe. When you look up there, the known universe, and you calculate every atom, every hydrogen atom there. And just 150 base pairs of our gene has way more possible mutations than that number. It's staggering. So in many of these tests, they will see a mutation that they've never heard of before. It's unique to the person. And because it's never been heard of, they call it a variable of unknown significance, and they'll just not tell you about it when it could be a very damaging mutation.
But with the overexpression testing, that you skip that kind of like you get around.
We have a different way of analyzing it. We have this seven or eight different software programs that we use to model, and we also look at something called sequence conservation, and where we compare that particular position to a bunch of different primates, which are our closest living relatives, and a bunch of different mammals. And if it's not allowed to, if we don't see changes in that position, then we know that it's highly conserved and that a mutation at that particular point would be damaging to the gene.
Okay, so there's numerous things that you look at on top of just the raw test data.
No, we look at, on top of the raw. We look at the raw data plus many other things, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
One more piece before we start getting to treatment options. Oh, actually, a couple more pieces, but I always like to ensure that folks feel hopeful because there's so much dismaying news out there in general right now, but especially, for cancer patients so often. Doors feel like they're just constantly closing rather than opening. So the testing that we're talking about is a way to make sure all the possible doors that could open for you are opened. And you know what Alex was saying earlier about, well, we might have a hard time getting an oncologist to go along with something that's an off-label. The reality is we actually are quite successful at that on the advocacy side. So don't be concerned about that. But I wanted you to know that right now in the world, there are over 100,000 clinical trials for cancer. And clinical trials today are very different from what they were a few decades ago because of the advent of this genetic testing. So the short version for you is that I really want you to know is if you go through this process of figuring out exactly what treatments are matched for you and what you need, and there just seems to be a barrier to you accessing them through your public healthcare oncologist. There are many options that you can explore, and one of them includes this 100,000 clinical trials. And in clinical trials these days, for the most part, people don't need to go and attend a facility in order to access clinical trials. You can access and receive the treatment that you need in your hometown, and usually from your current oncologist with just a little bit of paperwork, assuming that you are a fit for the trial. And clinical trials at this time, what that really means is we already know this drug works better than standard care. We're just trying to confirm the dose, and really that's kind of at the point that they're testing it out on you. That's really what they're looking for. So really great benefit that can come from this. And it's as easy as plugging in a little bit of your personal data into an automated system and getting an immediate list of all trials that are relevant to you. So it used to, just even 3 years ago, it used to take us 30 hours just to try to track down all the trials that could be relevant for somebody. Now we can do that for you within 10 minutes. So it might feel overwhelming, but there's great technology and support out there to explore that if that's where your journey takes you. So we were talking about the 4 pillars of precision oncology, the first one being the testing we've just run through. The second one really being, now we've got all this data, how do we make sure we're applying it to you as effectively as possible? And we do that by using essentially this list plus many, many other elements. Looking at everything that pertains to you specifically, how those mutations are showing up, how they might be influencing each other, how the combined treatments for the different mutations that you might have will work, which to apply when, and then accessing those things. All of that is critically important to you getting the treatment that you need as quickly as possible. So Alex, now let's talk about what a targeted therapy is. We'll just briefly default into that, and then please list for us these new options that you found.
Yeah, there's some exciting new options we're going to go over. Basically, a targeted therapy is a drug that targets either overexpression or a specific mutation or a fusion protein in cancer.
Okay.
And the way to determine whether you can benefit from a specific targeted therapy is to get tumor DNA sequencing and overexpression analysis.
Mm-hmm. And if I may expand on that a little bit, because I think it's just, what I hear so often when folks reach out to us for the first time about cancer care is I don't want chemotherapy. And the reason most people feel that way is because either they've known somebody or they've heard tell of the side effects of chemotherapy that can be less effective, of course, but also these side effects. And one of the great benefits of targeted therapies is that as a rule, they produce fewer side effects for people by far, because they're not affecting all rapidly reproducing cells. They're only affecting the cell that has the mutation that the drug is targeted for, and that is the part of the cell that you need attended to in order to get rid of cancer or to keep it at bay as best you can. So targeted therapies are highly effective because they're getting straight to the mark, but they also are far better tolerated as a rule. And again, you can't get targeted therapies without this genetic testing. Alex mentioned off-label treatments earlier, but just simply, they're drugs that were designed for other things, maybe different types of cancer, but usually other things entirely, like heart problems or blood pressure problems or things like that, that have actually also been found to target certain mutations. So they are available. They're usually very inexpensive or covered by public health care. You just need that testing to link you to those treatments. So it's kind of an exciting little side development that genetic testing has brought to cancer patients. All right, Alex, let's talk
so we'll
about
dive in. As I mentioned, we'll probably focus on diffuse large B cell. I think it's probably the biggest concern and the one that causes the most problems. And eventually, most people with lymphoma are going to have to deal with this issue. So before we get started on that, when a lymphoma has a recurrence or is relapsed, it's called symptomatic. And the big question is chemotherapy required? Do we need to use R-CHOP for first-line symptomatic non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? And I think there's been a lot of research on this. There's a couple of old studies that came out quite a while ago. Way back when, they did these two studies called the Still and the Bright study. And they compared bendamustine and rituximab to R-CHOP and RCVP in indolent lymphomas. And what they found after follow-up is in the 10-year overall survival in the Still study, the overall survival was 71%. So a little bit about statistics in cancer. Overall survival refers to, it's a number or it's a time frame when 50% of the patients in the trial die. So if you have 100% or if you have 100 patients in a trial and at 10 years, 50% die, then they will look at that percentage of patients that is alive. In this particular case, they looked at the 10-year overall survival rate, and 71% of patients were still alive at 10 years when they took the bendamustine and rituximab without a significance in comparison to the R-CHOP. So R-CHOP, was roughly the same, but obviously, when you're taking these drugs, there's different side effects in the chemo. And we'll get into that a little later, why that's significant. So the Bright study showed a 5-year progression-free survival of 65.5% for the two drugs versus 55.8% for the R-CHOP CVP group. So they're seeing a difference in the 5-year progression-free survival. So progression-free survival is another statistic very much like overall survival. And it refers to when people have recurrence of their disease while on the drug. So when 50% of the patients in the trial have a recurrence, then they will mark that time down. In this case, they said, how many patients at 5 years have had a recurrence or have not had a recurrence, sorry, And it was 65.5% of those patients with the BR arm and 55 for the R-CHOP and the chemotherapy. There wasn't a big significant improvement in overall survival in this particular trial, but definitely these patients lived longer without their disease coming back without doing the chemotherapy. So I think that's a big important thing. And we'll get into why having R-CHOP can be a bit of a problem in a few slides.
Okay.
So how about refractory? And this is really what most of the people call us for, refractory NHL. So in this particular combination, rituximab, as you recall, it's a CD20 target monoclonal antibody, was combined with a drug called lenalidomide. Now, I'm sure many of you recall thalidomide. That was the drug that was banned back in the 60s and the 70s and so on. I believe it was a problem that caused birth defects. Since then, it's been repurposed and it's been altered. And lenalidomide is a derivative of thalidomide. There's also pomalidomide, which is another derivative. And they're quite effective in non-Hodgkin's lymphomas and some other diseases. So in this case, they looked at relapsed or refractory follicular and marginal zone lymphomas. And they found that the progression-free survival hazard ratio was 0.46. So a hazard ratio basically means what is your hazard of getting the disease back or dying? And so the progression-free survival hazard ratio is what is your chance of having the disease come back? And in this particular case, when they used this combination, they found it was 0.46. So to determine what that means, you have to consider that 1 is no change. Higher than 1 means that it didn't work very well, and lower than 1 means it did work well. So in this particular case, you would take 1, you would minus 46, and that would be the size of the reduction. So that would be a 54% reduction in the disease coming back with this combination. And that ranged from a 0.34 to 0.62%. So some patients it was 0.34, others it was 0.62, but the average was 0.46. In this study, they looked at the duration of the progression-free survival, and the progression-free survival was 39.4 months. The range was 22 to not reached. Not reached means during the course of the study, those patients still hadn't had their disease come back. So in some of those patients, their disease still hasn't come back. And that was compared to only 14.1 months for rituximab alone. So that's a significant difference. So combining, simply adding lenalidomide when you have relapsed refractory marginal zone lymphoma makes a huge difference. You know, 39.4 months versus 14.1 months for rituximab alone. Huge difference. So definitely consider that if you have this circumstance. You can go to the next slide. So now we're going to get into some targeted therapies. So one of the new targets that they've looked at in refractory follicular lymphoma is something called an EZH2 mutation. So in patients that have mutations in their EZH2 gene, there's a drug called tazemetostat. And this is an EZH2 inhibitor. So it's a targeted therapy. So it's FDA approved. So in patients that had refractory or relapsed follicular lymphoma, and they had these mutations, they had what's called an overall response rate of 69%. So basically what that means is if you have 100 patients in the trial, over 69 of them responded to this drug who had that mutation or had one of those EZH2 mutations. And that ranged from 53 to 82%. So at the best of cases, in the healthiest patients, 82% had a response to this drug. Now, not everyone has an EZH2 mutation, so they also looked at patients that didn't have an EZH2 mutation, and they found even in those patients, it was somewhat beneficial. And so the overall response, so someone who doesn't have an EZH2 mutation is referred to as wild type. Wild type means you don't have a mutation. So even in the wild type, it was still 34%. Obviously not as good as 69%, but that ranged from 22 to 48%. So definitely, if you have this, you want to check and see if you have an EZH2 mutation, and that would be done through tumor DNA sequencing. Next slide. So one of the newest advances that we know about in targeting of non-Hodgkin's lymphomas is there's a significant activation of the PIK signaling. This is one of the pathways that is fundamentally mutated in cancers. It's mutated in most cancers. And in this particular case, there's certain types of pathways of PIK signaling. They're called sub-pathways that are specific to this type of cancer. In breast cancer, it would be the PIK alpha pathway. In non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, it's the what we call the delta and also the beta pathway. So in this particular case, they had a drug called umbralisib, which is a targeted therapy for mutations or alterations in the PIK delta pathway and the CK1, which is another gene, ellipson pathway. And so this drug is FDA approved. It's approved for relapsed and refractory indolent marginal zone and follicular lymphoma. And so in this case, they had a response rate of 47.1%, but tumor reduction occurred in 86.4% of patients, which is very beneficial. So if you can go to the next slide. So another drug that targets the PIK alpha and PIK delta pathway is a drug called copanlisib, and it's approved for relapsed follicular lymphoma. So in this case, the overall response rate was 58.7% of patients with relapsed disease, and the range is 49 to 68%. So let's go to the next one. So let's talk about diffuse large B-cell lymphomas. Now, I've just touched on some basics of targeted therapies for these lower grade relapse refractory. There's actually quite a few different approaches. Tumor DNA sequencing really is the key there, and obviously expression testing is important. So mechanisms when a lymphoma transforms, when a low grade transforms into a high grade, the diffuse large B-cell lymphomas. If you recall, we talked about the GBC and the ABC and the double hit. This is just a slide that talks about these in a little more detail. So the GBC often contain a translocation, which means an exchange between chromosome 14, which contains the antibody heavy chain locus, and chromosome 18. So these two chromosomes kind of get stuck together and exchange bits of genetic information. It's called a crossover or translocation. So in chromosome 18, it contains the BCL2 locus. And so this is present in half of these types, but not necessarily in ABCs. So in the ABC subtype, which has a worse prognosis, it typically has activation of the NFK pathway, NFKB is called NF-kappa B pathway. And it's typically found in the ABC subtypes, but not always the GCB subtypes. And then in double hit lymphoma, they're typically called double hit because they express MYC plus either BCL2 or less likely BCL6. So basically a double expressor, which has a poor prognosis, overexpress the MYC and BCL2. So if you see BCL2 or BCL6 overexpression and MYC overexpression, then you have these double hit, double mutator subtypes. So precision oncology. So recently, there's been a few agents that have been approved by the FDA for diffuse large B cell. Now, I just spoke with a rep from someone involved with approvals for these drugs in Canada. And so it looks like one of the drugs, Tafasitamab, is going through the approval process. So's Polatuzumab Vedotin, still going through the approval process in Canada. But Selinexor is not yet, which is unfortunate. Now, once again, these are all approved by the FDA, so they're used in other countries. And then there's also CAR T cells, and Canada has been pretty slow on getting onto the CAR T cells. So these are what are available in other countries. You can probably get these drugs here via clinical trials, or if you pressure your local cancer agency and Health Canada, you could probably get compassionate access for these. That's what we would do, is we would say, hey, you know, the drug's in the process of approval. We know it works. It's being used everywhere else. You know, hurry up and approve it, Health Canada. So let's talk about these a little bit then. So Polatuzumab Vedotin. So this is a new technology. It's called an antibody drug conjugate. And this is an amazing new technology, which is basically what we call targeted chemotherapy. So in systemic chemotherapy, the chemotherapy drug's injected into you, or you take it orally, and it just happens to kill any rapidly reproducing cell that's in your body, which could cause a lot of side effects and is not necessarily good. And then also, you know, the drugs don't last very long in your body. So once they leave your body, then they don't affect any of the cancer cells. And so they typically don't affect the stem cells that cause the cancers in the first place. With targeted conjugates or targeted chemotherapy, antibody drug conjugates, you have an antibody that binds onto a specific molecular marker that is unique to those cancer cells, and it attaches a chemotherapy drug that is usually a very active chemotherapy drug that can't be given systemically because it's too toxic. And so you have one molecule of the chemotherapy drug attached to one antibody, and this antibody binds onto the outside of the tumor cell. And then, of course, it's, you know, injects this chemotherapy drug directly into that one tumor cell. So this is kind of like a dating service for tumor cells, where they get a bad date. They get a date of the chemotherapy drug. They get matched to the chemotherapy drug, and it gets attached to them, and that's it. They die. So one of the trials, they looked at relapse and refractory follicular lymphoma, but also diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And they compared it with bendamustine and rituximab versus bendamustine alone. So it was a triplet combination versus bendamustine alone. So the results in this study, the overall response was 45% of patients versus only 18%. The complete response, which is how many of those patients had, you know, the vast majority of their tumors shrink, or, you know, had a very exceptional response, was 40% versus 18%. And then the overall survival in this particular study, that's the average, 50%, was 12.4 months versus 4.7 months. Now, I should explain what the complete response is. It's typically you have 4 different responses, types of responses in an overall response. An overall response includes all of them. The first response is a complete response, where, as you can imagine, you know, most of the tumors, if not all, shrink, and you get a rapid response to the drug. A partial response is where some tumors shrink and then others are not affected by it, but still overall you get a good response. A stable disease is where the tumors don't shrink and they don't grow. All 3 of these are positive responses. Even a stable disease is a positive response because your cancer is not progressing. And then you have what's called a lack of response, which is the final response, and it's a negative response. And it's called, you know, disease progression. So if you want to go to the next slide, Michelle. So another trial called the Polarix looked at Polatuzumab Vedotin, and they did Polar plus R-CHP, and they compared with R-CHOP, which is what they often used in diffuse large B-cell lymphomas. R-CHOP is kind of the go-to and has been for many, many years. And so in this particular case, they compared it to R-CHOP in previously untreated patients with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And they used a PET CT to assess it, which is a good tool for doing that, obviously. And the complete response rate was 77%. So definitely a great response when combined with our CHP. The partial response was 12%. The progression-free survival, once again, 50% of the patients have still not had a disease recurrence at 2 years. That's a 50% of the patients. That was 83%, and it ranged from 73 to 93%. So progression-free survival at 2 years was 83%. That's really good. So the safety and tolerability of Pola-R-CHP, R-CHP, was similar to that of R-CHOP. So, you know, similar side effects, definitely a much better overall response. So next slide. So Selinexor. So this targets something called the nuclear export protein 1, or also known as XPO1. This is a unique protein, and it exports certain overexpressed proteins, not just in this type of cancer, but in you know, other cancers too. But in this particular case, it exports these proteins from the nucleus into the cytoplasm where they're needed. So these are typically proteins that are involved in oncogenic activity, promoting, you know, tumor growth and progression and so on. And so basically what happens is when you inhibit this protein, it causes a buildup of these tumor suppressors in the nucleus of the malignant cells and reduces levels of the oncogene products too. So it leads, no, can you go back, please? No. Back. Oh, right there. Yes. Okay. So it leads to cell cycle arrest and death of the cancer cells by apoptosis, which is referred to as programmed cell death. What's important is this drug not only targets proteins involved in the GBC subtype, which is, you know, obviously the best type to have, but it also targets proteins in the ABC subtype. So it works on both of these subtypes, and that's very important. It also reduces MYC and BCL2 and BCL6, which are found in the double hit subtype. And it blocks NF-kappa B activation. So that's also an important thing. So it's this drug is effective in both GBC and non-GBC subtypes. So can you switch slides? So another drug, Tafasitamab. And so this is an interesting new drug approach too. It's called the BiTE. And this is a great new technology. It's what we call bispecific T cell engager. And so T cells are the cells that kill cancer cells, and they have to bind onto the cancer cells in order to kill them. And so there's a bunch of processes that the cancer cells do to prevent T cells from binding onto them. We won't get into that right now. There's many different pathways that cancers use to inactivate the immune system. So obviously, having engagement and connection with T cells to the tumor cells is very important in fighting the cancer. So what this drug does is it binds onto something called CD19. And CD19 is present on the cancer cells. And it also binds onto, on the other end, so this is a bispecific antibody. So it's got, so basically think of it as having two separate antibodies. On this end, it binds onto the CD19 of the tumor cells. And then on the opposite end, it binds onto the natural killer cells, which are part of the immune system, as well as macrophages, which are another type of immune cell that kills cancer cells. And so macrophages are, as I mentioned, macrophages are immune cells that interact with T cells, and they help activate the T cells. So basically what it does is it binds, it attaches the tumor cell to not only the T cell, but also the macrophages to help activate that tumor cell. So then all of a sudden, you know, once again, this is like a dating service, a bad dating service for the tumor cell where it gets attached to what's going to kill it. This is a great new technology. So it basically causes the immune cells to attach to the tumor cells and the activation of the macrophages that activate it too. So great technology. Once again, this drug is approved and it should be in Canada fairly soon. It's in the process of being approved, but it's FDA approved. It's been used for a while. So next slide. So some data on this. The L9 clinical trial used Tafasitamab plus lenalidomide, the thalidomide derivative, in relapsed or refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma for patients who were ineligible for stem cell transplants. So a little word on diffuse large B-cell lymphomas. Typically what happens when they're refractory, what they do is they will give you what's called a platinum drug. And if you respond well to the platinum drug, then they'll give you high dose chemotherapy, and then they'll give you a stem cell transplant. However, if you don't respond well to the platinum drug, then they don't give you the stem cell transplant. So they give you the platinum drug as a way of determining whether you'll respond well to the chemotherapy that's used in the stem cell transplant and whether you'll get a benefit from stem cell transplant. Now, if you recall, I discussed R-CHOP earlier as a common solution and whether you need to use R-CHOP or not in the beginning when you have a low-grade follicular lymphoma. Well, the data shows that if you have R-CHOP earlier on in your cancer treatment, then you're much less likely to respond to a platinum therapy. And therefore, you're not going to be considered for a stem cell transplant. So once again, you know, when I mentioned that slide earlier, do you really need to get chemo in the beginning when you have, you know, low-grade follicular lymphoma? Well, it's going to determine whether you respond to a platinum therapy later on if you transform into diffuse large B cell. So, you know, once again, if you're considering R-CHOP, I would seriously consider that because it's going to reduce your chances of getting of responding to the platinum drug later on if you do get diffuse large B cell lymphoma. So therefore, if you are ineligible, then obviously Tafasitamab is going to be a potential treatment option for you. So if you have had R-CHOP, you have follicular lymphoma, and you've had R-CHOP earlier on, and then you get diffuse large B cell, and they want to determine whether you're eligible for a stem cell transplant or not, and you get a platinum therapy and you don't do well on it, then they say, sorry, you know, we're not going to give you a stem cell transplant. Then you can consider something like Tafasitamab. So there are options regardless of what you had. It's also important to consider what you take because it will have far-reaching implications down the road. So lenalidomide, once again, this is combined with Tafasitamab. The overall response here with the two drugs was an exceptional 60%, which is great. The complete response was 42.5%. And the duration, the 12-month duration of responses, which is similar to a progression-free survival. In other words, how long did you respond to this? In the GCB subgroup, it was 53% with a variation of 28 to 74%. So we would expect a good response in the GCB subtype. However, what is really remarkable with this drug is in the non-GCB subtype, which is typically the worst case scenario, they had an 83% response rate with a range of 47 to 96%. I think this is really significant. So definitely if you have an ABC subtype or a non-GCB or a double hit, then clearly this drug is the way to go. So next slide. So CAR T cell therapy. So as I mentioned, if you have diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, then they will give you the platinum drug to determine whether you're eligible for a stem cell transplant. If you fail that, then the previous drugs we just discussed are an option. Otherwise, you can go on to a stem cell transplant. If you are also ineligible and if they say to you, well, you have diffuse large B-cell therapy or diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, however, you're not healthy enough to get a stem cell transplant, so we're not even going to try the platinum therapy. Then what do? Well, now we know that potentially in those patients, CAR T cell therapy is a good option. And so for many patients, CAR T cell therapy is probably going to replace a stem cell transplant. And I think we're going to see more and more of this as we go on. It's like a mini stem cell transplant, but it's like a precision oncology based stem cell transplant. And so this really is going to be the way to the future, and it's going to replace stem cell transplants. So right now there are 3 FDA approved CAR T therapies. They all target CD19 on the tumor cells. And there are 3 approved for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. So can you go to the next slide, Michelle? So basically, what is a CAR T? In short, what it is you have your blood is drawn from the patients, and they isolate the T cells, and then they modify those T cells. So they get modified receptors and what we call co-stimulatory domains that target tumor antigens are basically introduced into the T cell using a viral vector. And so a viral vector is basically something that this is what we use for cloning in the labs. So what we do is we put the genes we want to have expressed in the cell or part of the new genome into this viral vector. Then we infect those T cells with this virus, and the virus inserts these new genes into the genome of the T cells. And so basically the genes it's adding are modified receptors and co-stimulatory domains that will help the T cells target the tumor cells much better. And so basically they grow these new T cells, these modified T cells in a petri dish, and then they infuse them back into the patient. So, however, before they give you these new modified CAR T cells, before they infuse them into you, they have to kill off the old T cells that are not working so well for you. So they give you what they call a lymphodepletion chemotherapy. So in other words, you get this chemotherapy that kills all your T cells, and then they inject these new T cells, these new modified, lab modified T cells back into you, and they infuse them back into you. So it's a bit of a process. So can you go to the next slide? So right now, the CAR T cells that are approved for diffuse large B-cell lymphomas are the axi-cell. And so this one uses what's called the CD28 co-stimulatory domain, and it's introduced by what's called a gamma retroviral vector. And this is basically a retroviral vector. Retroviruses are viruses that do reverse transcriptase, and they can insert things back into your genome. So in this particular case, the overall response rate was 84%, which is just phenomenal. The complete response rate was 58%. Progression-free survival was 5.9 months, and the overall survival in this study was not reached, which is great news. Then they have this new one, tisagenlecleucel. I can't even say this. And this uses something called the 4-1BB co-stimulatory domain. And it's introduced by what's called a lentiviral. In this particular one, the overall response rate was 54%. Complete response rate was 40%. Progression-free survival, 2.9 months. And then the overall survival was 11.1 months. And then the last one that's FDA approved is called Liso-cel. It also uses the 4-1BB co-stimulatory domain, and it's also introduced by a lentiviral vector. In this particular case, the overall response rate was 73%, complete response rate was 53%, progression-free survival was 6.8 months, and the overall survival was 21 months. So definitely not all CAR Ts are the same. There's many new CAR Ts being developed right now. There's a ton of great new ones, but CAR T is definitely here and now today. And before you do it, you should look into all of the options and try to determine which ones are best. Now, I didn't talk about what else is next. In patients that have failed CAR T. There's a whole new class of drugs that are really getting some great responses in diffuse large B cell. So even after patients have had CAR T and that stopped working, there's a whole class of drugs called BiTEs. And these drugs typically connect CD3 to the activated T cells. So this is another incredible new technology that introduces the immune cells to the tumor cells. One of the drugs is called Glofitamab, another one IgM 2323, Epcoritamab, Mosunetuzumab, a bunch of different ones in clinical trials, and they're showing great responses right now. So, stem cell transplants and CAR Ts are not the end of treatment options for diffuse large B-cell lymphomas. There's a lot going on. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, next slide.
It's lucky that we don't know how to pronounce these things in order for you to get access to them. They
usually have easier names once they're fully approved and on the market.
Yes, that's right.
So next one. So concerns with CAR T therapy. So you could get what's called cytokine release syndrome. So in other words, if you have a lot of tumor cells and then the CAR Ts work really well, then it's going to release a lot of toxins into your blood, and it can create a lot of toxicity. So, they can work too well sometimes. If you have a lot of tumors, you may want to go with a CAR T so if you have a lot of tumors, you probably want to go with a CAR T that is less effective, so you don't have to worry about cytokine release syndrome. They can also affect the blood-brain barrier, which can result in neurotoxicity. So some pathogens in the blood-brain barrier in the endothelial cells also have CD19, so the CAR T cells will attack them too. And it's fairly expensive, although it's being done all over the world. I mean, I see now hospitals in India and all these other countries that are offering, all these private facilities that are offering CAR T therapy, and it's much cheaper than in the States or Europe or so. So, you can get CAR T therapy for significantly less than what it used to be. And the price is just going to continue coming down as there's more CAR T approaches. Next slide.
Okay. Ooh.
There we go.
Summary. All right. And then, so we'll just run through the key pieces that we've just covered. And then we're going to open up the discussion for questions about your case specifically. So we started out a while back talking about what cancer is, that it's caused by mutations in your genes, and that right now there are over 600 known cancer-related genes that can be tested for, and tens of thousands of possible related mutations. We talked about 3 key elements you want to make sure are included in your diagnostics, and that is fusion genes, mutations, and overexpression, so that you can make sure that you're looking at all the possible options and that they're the right ones for you. Tumor DNA testing focuses more on identifying fusion genes and mutations. The RNA expression testing looks at the overexpression. So if you want to cover those 3 key bases, you need both tumor DNA testing and RNA expression testing. It really is critical for figuring out the right treatment and for giving your oncologist the evidence they need in order to prescribe the treatments that are best for you. They really can't do that without this information. We know that targeted therapies statistically provide longer life expectancy and better quality of life during and after treatment. And this is because they are matched to you and the mutations that are causing your cancer. And as a rule, they deliver the drug directly to the cell or the part of the body that is specifically affected by the cancer, and not like in a shotgun approach to all rapidly reproducing cells. So they're more targeted, more effective, with less side effects. Right now, there are hundreds of targeted therapies approved for use with FDA and Health Canada, numerous different types of immunotherapy, and 100,000 clinical trials for cancer in the world right now. Of course, not all of them are going to be right for you, but out of 100,000, there's probably at least one or two in there that are addressing some, if not all, of the mutations that are most important for you to be targeting. And there are new treatments approved every week as a result of these trials and all the studies that are going on. So yes, approved. Oh, Alex, what?
Yeah. If I may say something, Michelle, sorry to
Please,
interrupt you. You know, I think, you know, some people say, well, you know, why do we spend so much on the testing of precision oncology and the mechanisms? But I think what is so important to understand is that if you do not understand how these tests work and why they're important, you have no chance of determining which one of these clinical trials is going to be best for you. Mm. So yes, there are these clinical trials. Yes, there are these great drugs, but without knowing the molecular features of your tumor, you're never going to be able to accurately determine what treatment is best for you. Yeah,
that's right. So there's our point 7 there, is that you need that diagnostics, and it's coming as part of standard care, but it's slow. It's taking a while and not the most thorough. So there are definitely ways to get access to those tests and ensure that your current public healthcare oncologist utilizes that information to your best benefit. And we find it's well over 90% of the time when we do this type of testing and research for our clients, that their public healthcare oncologist is on board to prescribe the treatments that we found. And that's because it's not our opinion. It's not us telling them what to do. It's us gathering the diagnostics and the research and the evidence that they need in order to provide you with the best treatment. So I just want to wrap up this piece by letting you know how to reach me here. If you have any other questions now or 2 years down the road, you want to know a little bit more about some of the things we've talked about, or just check in and make sure that you're doing the best that you can for yourself. Something we didn't get to talk about today, but we often talk about with our clients, is lifestyle. You know, what is a healthy diet as a cancer patient, and one that can actually address and actively target some of those mutations that are driving your cancer? That's something that's important to consider. What supplements should you be taking or not, and during treatment or not? So many questions that can really create a sense of paralysis on the part of cancer patients in terms of doing the best that they can for themselves, because it's just so overwhelming with all the different options that are out there. And that's really why we exist. And of course, if you're interested, you can book in a consultation with Alex to address your case specifically and have him prepare some research and treatment options for you. And lastly, I just want to let you know that we have a self-advocacy training program that we're just rolling out right now. I'm still putting on the finishing touches on the back end, but we're looking for beta testers. And this is a course that will be facilitated by myself and a couple of my teammates. Alex will be popping in and answering questions, and we've prepared a lot of information, handouts, forms, all the stuff that you need to take action on the things that we've talked about here, so that you can be your own best advocate and make sure you're getting the things that you need. So at any point, if you'd like to know more about that, or just be able to get access to that education program, you can just reach out to me, Michelle Morand, at mmorand@ctome.com. And all this information will come to your email as well. So I'm just going to stop my sharing here. And Alex, let's answer some questions. So I wanted to let you know that Leonard, who has left our chat now, but he said that Alberta government apparently has just approved CAR T cell, and I'm sure there are some very special circumstances around that. But I don't know if that's something that you've heard yet, but that's good news.
No, I haven't heard that yet, and I wonder which drug it is. You know,
yeah.
And that's
Yeah, the good news is things are moving forward.
Yeah.
These things are being absorbed, and they're not as far away as you might think.
No.
So now I would just love to invite anybody who has questions about your case specifically, or cancer care in general, to please just go ahead and either raise your hand or post your questions in the chat so that we can address them. Give you a moment. Yes, Diana. Excellent. Thank you. Without you, we'd be.
Am I the only one left?
You're there's a few others still here. It's a long chat and it's heavy stuff,
yes,
isn't it? So yeah. So thanks for sticking around, Diana. It's been good to have you here. How can Alex assist you today?
Well, I don't know if you're aware that in British Columbia, there is an age limit on stem cell transplantation, which is 70 years.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that any of these new therapies are also going to have an age limit like that too.
No, no, they don't. The stem cell limit is fairly arbitrary. It doesn't consider a lot of important factors. And in other countries, they will do stem cell transplants on older patients. I think 70 is a bit of an arbitrary, number. I think that's more of a cost issue. These other drugs, including CAR T, are available. Sorry, let me turn my phone off. It's answering me. These other drugs are definitely options for patients over 70. And by all means, yes, I think, I think we're just going to see less and less of stem cell transplants. I don't think they're the greatest solution at all. I think it's kind of a little on the old school side of things. And there's a lot of side effects and a lot of things that can go wrong with the stem cell transplant. So with all of these new drugs and so on, it's just, these are options for people who are older than 70.
And I was told by my oncologist that even if I did have stem cell transplant, that I might not survive it.
So what sort of cancer do you have then, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I'm in remission, but it's large diffuse B cell.
You know if you had the GBC or ABC or double hit?
That I don't know.
Oh,
I've never heard any of those terms.
Yeah, so that needs to be determined. And it's likely your doctor has not even considered that. I hate to say it, but lymphoma treatment in Canada is archaic. Which does surprise me that we have CAR T being approved in Alberta.
Well, again, it might be as part of a particular study. Obviously, we have to look into it more. Okay, so back to Diana. So Diana,
first thing you need to do is to determine, which subtype you have.
And how would she do that?
Well, it might, there may have been some basic genetic testing done early on. It could be somewhere in your pathology report. There could be something there. Otherwise, I would consider getting genetic testing. I would get, a Foundation 1 heme, which will tell you a lot of important information, but you want to have that information so you can determine which sort of drugs are best for you. Plus any of the options that we talked about today, they're in the process of getting Health Canada approval. So it's likely that you could push and get one of those drugs when it's needed.
If needed, hopefully not needed, but
exactly.
Yes.
If and when it's needed. So how long have you had diffuse subtype?
I was first diagnosed 11 years ago.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I was treated successfully with CHOP-R and nothing else.
Okay.
And I went into remission for 9 years.
Yeah.
And it came back.
Okay.
And they had a big decision to make. Is this a new case of the same type, or is this a relapse?
Yeah.
So that took quite a long time for the team to decide. When they decided it was a new case.
A new case.
A new case of the same thing. So they treated me with CHOP-R, but with one of the drugs taken out and a different one put in, because one of the drugs had apparently given me a really bad heart.
Oh, no.
So they didn't put me back on that one.
Yeah, and see, that's the problem with that. I would seriously consider the BR for your treatment, and not and just avoid the CHOP altogether. As we've shown, the responses are much better.
The BR?
Yeah, it's if you go back over the slides, you'll see it. It's all in there. Yeah.
It'll be in your PDF too.
Yeah, PDF, yeah.
Thank you for this and for all the notes that you're going to send me. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. We want to make it so that you can just take action and start making this happen for yourself.
Yeah, but I would definitely get proper sequencing, proper sequencing. It's I mean, treating cancer without it is just guesswork, literally.
Yeah, it's how it had to be in the past, but no more.
No, exactly.
Diana, we can certainly help you if you'd like. We can get a hold of your medical records and have a look to see if that subtype has been identified, and if Alex can therefore refine his recommendations for you. We could certainly do that for you within a couple of days.
Well, I'll keep it in mind, but so far I'm fairly healthy. I've had this second lot of chemo and the radiation, and that finished over a year ago. So things seem all right. So hoping I've got another 9 years, but you never know.
I would definitely, I have to be honest with you. I would plan right now for the future. I would plan for your next line of treatment. I mean, you could have the GBC, but typically with this type of chemotherapy, it's roughly under 2 years with the diffuse subtype. So you probably will see recurrence, and I would, plan for that.
Okay. I have an oncology appointment coming up in January, so I will have lots more questions.
Yeah, take the handout with them and make sure you ask them about that stuff. And in many provinces, and BC is one of them, you can access your medical records electronically fairly easily. So you should be able to have a look and see what if any testing was done, and gather that information. Again, we're here to help if need be, but yes, please do ask those questions when you go in January. And see if you can find out a little bit more. And we do try to be very optimistic and inspiring here. And so when I hear Alex say, I would just make sure that you had options just in case, I just want to say that's, I would take that to heart and see what you can do to just be prepared to hit the ground running should that worst case occur.
You want to know which drug you want to do next.
Yeah. Well, again, Diana's still hoping she isn't going to need any more drugs. And we're hopeful of that too.
We are, definitely.
And of course, what we see are the folks for whom that was not the case. And so, we're erring on the side of making sure you're extra prepared and again, ready to get the best treatment. So,
well, very interesting. And I will read this over when I print it off.
Yeah, good for you. You can get through it. I'm impressed. There's a lot of stuff there. Thanks very much for being here. Anybody else have any questions before we
I'm going to leave now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Diana. Nice to meet you. Take good care. Leonard, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I've had my stem cell transplant with a donor. It'll be almost a year now.
Okay.
And right now, what we're dealing with, my counts are still low. So we do weekly blood work, and now starting Monday, they want me to start taking a GCF shot twice a year.
Yeah.
Trying to get counts up, eh?
Yeah.
So another question is, like 5 years down the road, or when I'm considering possibly maybe going back to work in the springtime. Is that too early, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, what kind of cancer did you have?
The non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
What subtype?
What's that? Sorry.
What subtype did you have?
Lymphoma.
Many types of lymphoma. They're all very different. did you have follicular, mantle cell?
And mantle cell, sorry.
Oh, you had mantle cell. Okay. Okay. So I would say, mantle cell, you probably have a very good prognosis. I would say you're probably going to be okay to go back to work soon if you feel comfortable. I mean, definitely you have to, work, with your doctors and make sure that your blood counts are good and make sure that you're eating well and taking care of yourself and getting some exercise and so on.
Right.
Daily exercise. Lifestyle is very, very important when you're recovering from a stem cell transplant.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's good to hear. You bet. All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Leonard.
Lots of luck. Lots of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Val, did you want to ask a question? I know you were unmuted there for a second, but it got a little noisy, so I had to mute you. Did you have a question for us? Just going to give you a moment there, Val. You're welcome to unmute yourself now if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. But go ahead and chime in any moment before we hang up if you are trying to get through here, or post your question in the chat, Val. Okay, so that was a lot of information about cancer care in general, about precision oncology, and specifically about some innovative treatments. As you said at the start of our chat today, Alex, you yourself had to really kind of pick and choose what to share today because there were so many options, so many new treatments with some really great benefits to people over those of standard care. So this was a very short list of all the possible options available. I just want to reiterate that. So if you're watching this at home and you looked through that list, I mean, it's still a pretty good list in terms of the outcomes, but there's so many more. Again, finding out which ones are right for you and then making sure that your oncologist has all of the information they need to prescribe them and get that going for you is the critical element. All right, is there anything else you want to add about just words of wisdom, parting thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, I think, basically lymphoma is one of these cancers that's a bit of a black box. And that's because it's a very complicated disease. It's a complex disease. Many oncologists will not kind of delve into it and they'll leave it up to the specialists. But I think it's really important to dig deep and find out what is available for you, what is being done elsewhere in the world, and how it's being done. Because I think you'll see that there's actually quite a bit of variation between different, different centers, and there's a lot of new things available. And it's when you have an isolated subtype like this, or a type of cancer like this, where you only have specialists looking at it, then you don't benefit from the general oncologists that look at many different types of cancers, and you don't see how advances in other cancers can benefit your type of cancer. So it's kind of like it's a bit of a disease. It's a bit of an orphan in a sense, where only the lymphoma specialists are the ones that are typically involved in treatment, where there's a lot of things that can come from other areas of cancer treatment. So definitely, things like sequencing and expression testing can be very important. Using a sequencing panel that's specific for lymphomas, definitely, an important thing to do for every person with lymphoma.
Thanks, Alex.
That's it.
All right, well, thanks very much for being here today. Those of you who are watching the replay or checking this out down the road, thanks for sticking with us. Hope you found it beneficial. The replay and the PDF that comes with all of this, with all the extra information written down for you, will be sent to you via email if you've registered for this webinar. And of course, either Alex and myself or any of our team are available to answer any questions for you. We have a Facebook page. There's our thecancerguy.com is our YouTube channel. There's lots of excellent videos about cancer care in general and your type of cancer. So go ahead and visit us on YouTube at thecancerguy.com. And thanks again for being here. And we look forward to hearing from you and helping you in any way that we can.
Bye.
Bye-bye.